Rain poured down on the Berlin streets, neon lights casting red shadows across wet cobblestones. The city blurred through the downpour. Daniel, a man in his late 30s, stepped out from the hospital entrance, his coat soaked through, his face hollow with exhaustion and despair. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a woman gaunt and trembling, her eyes glistening with tears and rain. It was Mira, his ex-wife, the woman who had vanished without a trace 7 years ago. She moved closer, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Your blood, it can save him." Daniel's world, already shattered once before, crumbled all over again. Daniel Hoffman was 38 years old and had spent the last 7 years learning how to be both father and mother to his son Jonas. Since the day Mira disappeared, he had built their life from the ruins she'd left behind. Cooking meals, attending school meetings, bandaging scraped knees, and answering the one question he could never truly answer. Where's Mom? He worked as a civil engineer, a job that provided stability, if not passion. His days followed a careful routine designed to keep both him and Jonas afloat. Wake up, make breakfast, drop Jonas at school, work, pick up Jonas, homework, dinner, bedtime, repeat. The routine was armor against the chaos that Mira's abandonment had created. The only remnant of his old life was the watch he wore every day. A simple timepiece Mira had given him on their 5th anniversary, just months before she left. He didn't wear it out of love anymore, but as a reminder never to trust so completely again. Jonas was 10 now, a bright boy with his mother's eyes and his father's quiet strength. He'd stopped asking about his mother years ago, accepting Daniel's vague explanation that Mom had to go far away. But sometimes late at night, Daniel would hear Jonas crying softly in his room, and he'd know the boy was mourning a mother he could barely remember. Mira had been different once, radiant, full of life, laughing easily and loving fiercely. That woman seemed like a dream now, someone Daniel had imagined rather than married. The evening everything changed started ordinarily enough. Jonas had been at soccer practice, and Daniel had stayed late at the hospital waiting for test results. His mother had been ill, and he'd been handling the paperwork. When he finally emerged into the rainy night, exhausted and worried, he saw her. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks. 7 years of absence, and suddenly there she was, stepping from the shadows like a ghost made flesh. Mira looked nothing like the woman who'd left. She was painfully thin, her clothes worn and ill-fitting, her face marked by hardship and sleepless nights. But her eyes, those eyes he'd once loved, were the same, now filled with desperate pleading. "Daniel," she said, her voice cracking, "I know I have no right." "You're right," he interrupted, his voice hard. "You have no right. Not to anything. Not after 7 years of silence." Jonas, who had been waiting in the car, suddenly appeared at Daniel's side. The boy froze when he saw Mira, his face going pale. Is that Mom?" Jonas whispered, his voice small and confused. Mira's face crumpled, tears mixing with rain. "Jonas, you've grown so much." But before any reunion could happen, before Daniel could demand explanations or Jonas could process seeing the mother who'd abandoned him, Mira spoke the words that would change everything. "Your son," she said, looking directly at Daniel. "Our other son. He needs you. Your blood type is the only match. Your blood can save him." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Another son? 7 years of questions suddenly had an answer he'd never imagined, and it was somehow worse than anything he'd feared. As rain continued to fall and Jonas looked between his parents with growing confusion, Daniel thought, 7 years. I've imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. The hospital waiting room became a confessional, with fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on 3 faces marked by shock, anger, and desperate hope. Mira sat with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Jonas sat close to his father, stealing glances at the mother he barely remembered, while Daniel stared at Mira with a mixture of rage and disbelief that 7 years hadn't diminished. "Tell me," Daniel said, his voice controlled but trembling with suppressed emotion. "Tell me everything. You owe us that much." Mira took a shaking breath and began. 7 years ago, I discovered I was pregnant. It wasn't planned. Nothing was planned. I was already struggling with depression, with feeling like I was failing as a mother to Jonas. And then, another baby. She paused, wiping tears from her face. I panicked. I couldn't face you. Couldn't face the thought of failing another child. So I left. I just left. Daniel's fist clenched. You left your 5-year-old son. You left me, without a word, without an explanation. Do you have any idea what that did to us? I know, Mira whispered. I know I'm a coward. I know I destroyed our family, but I was drowning, Daniel. Every day felt like I was suffocating, and I thought you'd both be better off without me. That wasn't your choice to make, Daniel said, his voice breaking. Jonas spoke up suddenly, his young voice cutting through the tension. You had another baby? I have a brother? Mira nodded, pulling out a photograph from her worn purse. The image showed a pale, thin boy of about 7, lying in a hospital bed, clutching an old toy car. His eyes were closed, his breathing clearly labored even in the still photograph. His name is Leo, Mira said. He's 7 years old. He has a rare blood disorder, aplastic anemia. He needs a bone marrow transplant. But first he needs blood transfusions just to survive long enough for the procedure. She pulled out another item, a faded teddy bear, its fur worn smooth from handling. Jonas gasped when he saw it. That's my bear, my old bear that went missing. Mira nodded, tears streaming down her face. I took it with me. I wanted Leo to have something from his brother, even if they never met. I wanted him to feel like he had family, even though I destroyed ours. Daniel stood abruptly, needing distance. So you come back after 7 years, not to apologize, not to explain, not to try to repair what you broke, but to ask for blood. I know how this looks, Mira began. You don't know anything, Daniel shouted, years of contained anger finally breaking free. You don't know what it was like explaining to a 5-year-old why his mother didn't come home. You don't know how many nights Jonas cried himself to sleep. You don't know how I had to learn to braid his hair by watching YouTube videos, or how to explain periods and puberty because you weren't there. The waiting room had gone silent, other visitors pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. Mira was sobbing openly now. You're right. I don't know any of that because I wasn't brave enough to stay. I've lived in shame and guilt every single day. I've moved from city to city, working whatever jobs I could find, trying to raise Leo alone while knowing I'd abandoned Jonas. She moved closer to Daniel, desperate. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I don't deserve your help, but Leo does. He's innocent in all of this. And according to the doctors, you're the only match. Your blood type, your genetic markers, you're his only chance. Jonas, who had been quietly processing everything, suddenly spoke up. Dad, can I see him? Can I see my brother? Daniel looked at his son, this brave, beautiful boy who had grown up without a mother and was now learning he had a brother he'd never known about. The situation was impossibly complicated, emotionally devastating, and yet Jonas was thinking about Leo. The doctors say he's too weak for visitors right now, Mira said gently to Jonas. But soon, I hope. Daniel walked to the window, looking out at the rainy Berlin night. His mind was racing, his heart torn between the betrayal he felt and the image of a sick child who shared his blood. Why didn't you reach out sooner? He asked quietly. Why wait until it's life or death? Because I'm a coward, Mira admitted. I told myself Leo was better off not knowing about the family I destroyed. That you and Jonas were better off not knowing about him. But when he got sick, when the doctors said he needed family, I had no choice. He's dying, Daniel. Without your help, he'll die. Daniel turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. I spent 7 years hoping you'd come back, hoping you'd walk through the door and explain everything, hoping we could be a family again. He paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. But you're not here for us. You're here for blood. The truth of those words hung in the air, impossible to deny and devastating to acknowledge. Mira had not returned out of love or regret or hope for reconciliation. She had returned out of desperate necessity to ask the man she'd abandoned to save the child he'd never known existed. The next morning brought more complications in the form of Carl Fisher, a well-dressed man in his 40s who arrived at the hospital with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "So you're the ex-husband," Carl said, looking Daniel up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Mira's told me about you." "And you are?" Daniel asked coldly. "Carl Fisher. I've been living with Mira and Leo for the past 4 years. I'm the only father Leo has ever known." The words were clearly meant to wound, and they succeeded. Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Not just one child had grown up without him, but 2, and this stranger had filled the role he'd never been given the chance to fill. "Then where's your blood?" Daniel asked sharply. "If you're his father, why isn't your blood saving him?" Carl's expression hardened. "I would if I could, but I'm not a match. None of us are. Only you." Dr. Schmidt, the hematologist overseeing Leo's case, joined them with paperwork. "Mr. Hoffman, we need to discuss the transfusion. Your blood type and genetic markers make you uniquely suited to help Leo. Without this transfusion, he won't survive long enough for the bone marrow transplant procedure." Daniel looked at the consent forms, his hands trembling slightly. Everything in him wanted to sign immediately. A child was dying, and he had the power to help. But the complexity of the situation, the weight of Mira's betrayal, and Carl's hostile presence made him hesitate. "You don't owe them anything," Carl said suddenly, his voice sharp. "Mira left you. She made her choice. If you want to walk away, no one could blame you." "That's enough, Carl," Mira interjected, her voice strained. "No, he's right to consider it," Carl continued, his voice rising. "Why should you help? Let the consequences fall where they belong. Maybe then Mira will finally understand what her choices cost." Daniel felt rage building in his chest. "You think I'd let a child die to punish his mother? What kind of person do you think I am?" "I think you're a man who was abandoned and has every right to be angry," Carl shot back. "I think you're a man who should put yourself and your son first, not clean up Mira's messes." "Leo isn't a mess," Daniel said, his voice dangerous. "He's a child, an innocent child who didn't ask to be born into this complicated situation." That's when Jonas appeared, having slipped away from the hospital cafe where Daniel had left him. The boy had been crying, his eyes red, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Dad, if my blood could save someone, I'd give it. Even if I didn't know them. Even if their mom had hurt us." He looked at Daniel with heartbreaking maturity. "Because that's what you taught me. You said we help people when they need it, no matter what. The simple morality of a child cut through all the complexity, all the anger, all the justifiable resentment." Daniel felt his resolve crumbling. Mira, who had been silent through most of the exchange, suddenly dropped to her knees in front of Daniel. Her pride, what little remained of it, disappeared in the face of her son's dying. "I've made every mistake a person can make," she said, her voice raw. "I abandoned my husband. I abandoned my son. I ran away from my responsibilities and my fears. I've lived in shame and regret every single day for 7 years." She looked up at Daniel with eyes that held nothing but desperation. "But Leo didn't make those mistakes. He's just a little boy who wants to live. He wants to play with toy cars and learn to ride a bike, and maybe someday meet the brother he never knew he had. Please, Daniel, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking for anything for myself. I'm begging you to save him." Carl started to object, but Mira cut him off. "No, Carl. This is between Daniel and me. This is about the family I destroyed and the family I'm trying to save." Daniel stood frozen, the consent form in his hands, the weight of multiple lives hanging on his decision. He thought about 7 years of single parenthood, 7 years of explanations to Jonas about why his mother left, 7 years of building a life from ruins. But he also thought about a 7-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. A boy who shared Daniel's DNA, his blood, his genetic code. A boy who was, undeniably, his son. "Jonas," Daniel said quietly, kneeling to his son's level. "If I do this, everything gets more complicated. Leah will be part of our lives. Maybe Mira will be too. Our quiet life, just the 2 of us. It might never be the same. Jonas wiped his eyes and looked at his father with a wisdom that broke Daniel's heart. Dad, you always say family is about more than blood. But this time, it really is about blood. And if he's my brother, then saving him is what family does. Daniel stood, looked at Mira's desperate face, at Carl's hostile expression, at Dr. Schmidt's patient professionalism, and at Jonas's hopeful eyes. He picked up the pen and signed the consent form. I'm not doing this for you, Mira, he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. I'm not doing it to forgive you or to reconcile or to rebuild what you destroyed. I'm doing this because that boy, Leo, deserves a chance to live. Every child deserves that chance. Mira collapsed in sobs of relief, while Carl turned away, unable to watch. Jonas hugged his father tightly, and Dr. Schmidt quietly took the papers. As Daniel was led away to prepare for the transfusion, he had one last thought. Forgiveness might start with saving a life, but it's a long road from here to healing. If you believe every child deserves a chance at life, leave a heart below. Sometimes forgiveness begins with saving a life. The transfusion took 3 hours. Daniel lay in the medical chair, watching his blood flow through tubes toward a child he'd never met, a son he'd never known existed. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional weight of the situation. In the recovery room afterward, weak but stable, Daniel learned that Leo's condition had stabilized. The transfusion had bought them time for the bone marrow transplant that might save his life permanently. He's asking about you, Dr. Schmidt said gently. Leo wants to meet his father. The word father still felt strange when applied to this other child, but Daniel found himself nodding. Can Jonas come too? When Daniel and Jonas entered Leo's hospital room, they found a pale, thin boy who looked startlingly like Jonas had at that age. Leo's eyes, Daniel's eyes, went wide when he saw them. You came, Leo whispered, his voice hoarse from medical procedures. Of course we came, Jonas said before Daniel could speak. He walked directly to Leo's bedside. I'm Jonas. I'm your big brother. Leo's face lit up despite his weakness. I have a brother? Yeah, you do, and he's been waiting to meet you. Over the following days, something unexpected began to happen. Jonas and Leo formed an instant bond, the way children sometimes do, uncomplicated by the adult pain and betrayal that surrounded them. Jonas would visit after school, bringing books and toys, teaching Leo card games and telling him stories about their father. Dad's the best, Jonas told Leo one afternoon. He makes terrible pancakes, but he tries really hard. And he always knows when you're sad, even if you don't say anything. Leo listened with wonder, learning about the father and brother he'd been denied, building a family connection that transcended the complicated circumstances of his birth. Mira was there often, trying to help but mostly staying in the background. She would bring meals to Daniel and Jonas, simple home-cooked food that reminded Daniel painfully of their early marriage. She helped Jonas with homework at a corner table in the hospital cafeteria, slipping back into the mother role with heartbreaking familiarity. One evening, Daniel found all 4 of them sitting together at Leo's bedside. Jonas was reading aloud from a book. Leo was laughing weakly at the funny parts, and Mira was gently smoothing Leo's hair. It was a moment of family that felt both completely natural and utterly surreal. Carl had left, unable to accept the new family dynamic. I can't watch this, he told Mira. I can't watch you rebuild the family you destroyed with the man you abandoned. Call me when you've made your choice. But Mira's choice was already becoming clear. She was choosing her sons, both of them, and hoping desperately that somehow the family she'd broken might be rebuilt, even if it would never be the same. Jonas suggested they plant flowers in the hospital's healing garden, something for Leo to look at from his window once he was strong enough to be moved to a regular room. Daniel agreed, and soon all 4 of them, Daniel, Mira, Jonas, and Leo in a wheelchair, were in the garden, hands dirty with soil, planting tulips. Why tulips? Leo asked, his voice still weak but curious. Because, Jonas explained seriously, they come back every year. Even when you think they're gone forever, they come back. The metaphor wasn't lost on the adults. Mira's hands trembled as she patted soil around a bulb, and Daniel had to look away, overwhelmed by the complexity of hope and hurt existing simultaneously. That evening, as they cleaned up in the hospital bathroom, Jonas asked the question that had been building. "Dad, are we going to be a family again?" Daniel knelt down to his son's level. "I don't know what we're going to be, Jonas. What happened can't be undone, and trust isn't rebuilt overnight. But what I do know is that we're choosing to care. We're choosing to be here for Leo, and maybe that's where we start. So we're not ready yet, but we're getting there?" "Something like that," Daniel replied, pulling his son into a hug. Mira overheard this exchange from the hallway, and when Daniel emerged, she looked at him with eyes full of cautious hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us this chance. For saving Leo, for not turning us away completely." Daniel didn't respond immediately. The wound she'd left was still too raw, the betrayal still too fresh despite the weeks that had passed. But watching Jonas and Leo together, seeing two brothers who deserved to know each other, he realized that his anger, while justified, was less important than the future they might build. "This isn't forgiveness, Mira," he said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it's a choice to not let the past destroy Leo's future, or Jonas's chance to know his brother." "I'll take that," Mira said quietly. "I'll take whatever you can give." In Leo's room, visible through the window, Jonas had fallen asleep in a chair beside his brother's bed, a book still open on his lap. The image of the two boys, finally together, was proof that even from the wreckage of betrayal, something worth saving could grow. If you believe broken families can bloom again, hit like to plant hope. 3 months after the initial transfusion, Leo was strong enough to go home. The bone marrow transplant had been successful, and while he still needed monitoring, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The question of where home was had been the subject of careful, painful discussions. Daniel's apartment was small, designed for 2, not 4. Mira had been living in temporary housing, moving from place to place. The simple logistics of their broken family trying to function together seemed insurmountable. But Jonas had solved it in the way children sometimes do, with uncomplicated clarity. "Why can't Leo stay with us?" he'd asked. "We have a couch. Mom can stay too if she needs to, until Leo is better." They're family. So Mira and Leo had moved into Daniel's apartment temporarily. It was cramped and awkward, full of unspoken tension and carefully maintained boundaries. But it was also, surprisingly, full of life in a way the apartment hadn't been in years. The morning of Leo's first day home from the hospital, Daniel woke to find the table set for 4 instead of 2. 4 bowls, 4 spoons, 4 glasses of juice. The simple domesticity of it made his throat tight. On the refrigerator, Jonas had taped a new drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands labeled Dad, Mom, Jonas, and Leo. The crayon illustration was childish and imperfect, but it represented something profound, a child's belief that broken things could be mended. Mira found Daniel staring at the drawing, tears in his eyes. "I don't know if we can do this," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if we can ever be a family again, not in the way we were." Mira nodded, her own eyes glistening. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness, Daniel. I don't expect anything. But if you and the boys still need me, if there's any way I can be part of their lives, I want to stay." Daniel turned to face her fully. 7 years ago, he would have given anything to hear those words. 7 years of loneliness and single parenthood had been spent hoping she'd return. But now that she was here, the wound was still too fresh, the betrayal still too painful. "I need time," he said finally. "We all need time. But for the boys, for Jonas and Leo, we can try. We can choose to show up, even when it's hard. That's all I'm asking," Mira whispered. Later that morning, sunshine streamed through the apartment windows as Jonas and Leo played with building blocks on the living room floor. Leo was still weak, moving carefully, but his laughter was genuine as Jonas helped him construct an elaborate tower. Mira and Daniel stood side by side in the kitchen, watching their sons, not quite touching, but closer than they'd been in years. "Thank you," Mira said softly, "for your blood, for your presence, for not turning us away completely." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He thought about the journey from that rainy night when she'd reappeared, desperate and broken, to this sunny morning with two boys laughing in his living room. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the family he'd once known. But it was something, and maybe something was enough. "Welcome home," he said finally, the words both an acknowledgement of her presence and a reminder that this home was different now, built on new foundations of cautious trust rather than the blind love of their youth. Outside the window, in the small planter box Jonas had insisted on setting up, the tulips they'd planted at the hospital were beginning to bloom. They pushed through soil that had seemed barren, proving that even in the coldest seasons, life found a way to return. The family gathered at the window to look at the flowers, 4 people trying to become something whole again. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be perfect, but for now they were choosing to stay, choosing to heal, choosing to believe that families, like tulips, could bloom again after the longest winters. Family isn't always perfect. Sometimes it breaks, disappears, and returns in pieces. But family is where we choose to heal, one decision at a time. If you want more stories where forgiveness and love triumph over despair, hit subscribe. The next story might touch you directly. Subscribe for more powerful stories of broken families finding their way home. Hit that bell.